Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. James takes Diep for an ultrasound, where they discover their baby is a boy, already showing a face that looks just like James. Overwhelmed with joy, they begin dreaming of the future, shopping for baby clothes, imagining his laughter, and building a home filled with love. The ultrasound brings them not only the image of their son, but also new strength and unity. James vows to stay by Diep's side, adjusting his work to be home before the baby's arrival. Together, they cherish simple moments, walking in the park, sharing hopes, and preparing for their child's first days. That night, under the stars, they whisper promises to their unborn son, hearts full of love and anticipation. Watch until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 1,000 followers. Your support means everything. Morning sunlight spilled through the curtains of Diep's modest home, painting the walls in soft gold. James stood by the doorway, his voice calm, yet brimming with excitement, as he told her it was time for the appointment. Today wasn't just any ordinary hospital visit. Today, they'd finally see their child. Diep's heart raced with a mix of nerves and joy, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the simple blouse James had bought for her. That shirt wasn't expensive, but to her, it carried the weight of his care and love. She paused at the mirror, brushing back her hair, catching the glow of her own smile. Her reflection revealed more than just her face. It showed the fragile strength she had carried through storms of doubt and hardship. Slipping into her sandals, she felt every step take her closer to the moment she had been dreaming of. Outside, James leaned against the car, watching her with eyes full of patience. He walked forward to take her bag, his steady voice reminding her that there was no need to rush. To Diep, those words felt like a promise, a shield against all the uncertainties she had carried. The car rolled down the quiet road, its gentle hum blending with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Through the window, Diep watched fields and rooftops blur into fleeting colors, each one a reminder of how far she'd come. Gratitude welled up inside her, not just for the chance to see her baby, but for the man beside her who had chosen to walk this path with her. James reached over, brushing her hand lightly, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. Diep clasped her fingers over her belly, whispering in her heart to the tiny life within, "We're about to meet you today." The hospital loomed ahead, its white walls gleaming under the sunlight. To many, it was just a building of antiseptic smells and cold corridors, but to Diep, it was a gateway to hope. Stepping out of the car, she felt her chest tighten, her breath catching as the realization struck. Today, she would see her child's face for the first time. Inside, the sterile light was sharp, but James's presence softened everything. He stayed close, his hand brushing against her shoulder, his low voice telling her not to be afraid. When the doctor greeted them with a professional smile and guided Diep onto the examination bed, her hands trembled against the sheet. The sound of the ultrasound machine filled the room, steady and mechanical, yet her heartbeat pounded louder than anything. The doctor moved the probe, and then it appeared, a flickering image on the screen, grainy yet miraculous. Diep's lips parted as tears formed in her eyes. The doctor's voice carried calmly through the room, explaining the baby's growth, pointing out tiny limbs and the curve of a face. Then came the words that made her entire world tilt. "It's a boy." James froze, his eyes widening, then narrowing as he leaned closer to the screen. The baby's profile came into focus, and he gasped softly, his voice catching as he whispered, "He looks just like me." The room seemed to pause in that moment. Diep turned to look at James, her tears streaming freely now, not from fear, but from overwhelming joy. She reached for his hand, and he squeezed hers tightly, his smile breaking into laughter that trembled with disbelief and wonder. The doctor, accustomed to these moments, simply nodded with a gentle smile, giving them space to absorb the miracle. James's gaze never left the screen, his eyes tracing every small detail, as though he were memorizing the contours of his son's face. Diep couldn't contain her emotions. Her chest swelled with love so powerful it threatened to spill over. She had dreamed of this moment, but reality was far brighter, far more overwhelming than she had imagined. When the doctor finished, offering advice on vitamins and care, Diep barely heard the words. Her mind was still wrapped around the image she had just seen, their baby boy, alive and thriving, carrying James's likeness. As they stepped out of the examination room, James placed his hand on her shoulder, his voice low but firm. "We're going to raise him together, Diep. No matter what happens." She nodded, her tears still fresh, but her smile radiant. In that instant, she knew that whatever storms lay ahead, they had already taken the first step toward a future filled with hope. Leaving the hospital, the sunlight seemed brighter, warmer than before. James led her toward the car, his hand never letting go of hers. The city's noise faded, replaced by the sound of her heartbeat, still echoing the image on that screen. For Diep, the world had shifted. She no longer walked alone. That afternoon, James took her to a nearby park, its pathways lined with trees, swaying gently in the breeze. Diep's spirit felt as light as the leaves fluttering above her. She watched children running across the grass, their laughter filling the air, and for the first time, she imagined her own son playing among them. James guided her to a bench under a blooming tree. His voice, warm and steady, broke the silence. He spoke of his dreams, not just of business and work, but of building a home where their son could grow in peace. His words painted pictures of quiet mornings, of shared meals, of guiding their child's steps through the winding paths of life. Diep listened, her heart tender. She shared her own hopes, simple things, like teaching their son kindness, showing him the value of hard work, and raising him to be someone who gave light to others. Their words mingled in the air, weaving a tapestry of promises not yet lived, but already felt. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the park. Diep leaned back, her eyes closed, letting the warmth wash over her. James sat beside her, his gaze fixed not on the horizon, but on her, on the woman carrying his child, on the future he was ready to fight for. When they finally rose to leave, the air had grown cooler, the sky tinged with orange and pink. James took her hand again, his grip steady. Diep glanced at him, her heart swelling once more. She realized that today wasn't just about seeing their baby boy. It was about seeing James in a new light. steadfast, loving, and deeply connected to the life they were creating together. That night, back at home, Diep stood by the window, gazing at the moonlit sky. She pressed a hand gently over her belly, whispering soft words to her son. James's laughter still echoed in her ears, blending with the memory of their baby's face. A smile curved her lips, and for the first time in a long while, her heart was unshaken by fear. She knew tomorrow would bring challenges, but tonight was a gift, one she would carry forever, etched into her soul like the image of their son on that glowing screen. The next morning dawned quietly, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and orange. Diep stirred awake, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The memory of yesterday's ultrasound flashed across her mind, the tiny face resembling James, the clear words of the doctor, "It's a boy." A smile tugged at her lips. For the first time in weeks, she woke not with worry, but with joy humming in her chest. James was already up, bustling in the small kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. The sound of clinking dishes and the smell of freshly cooked rice filled the room. He looked over when Diep entered, his smile wide and easy. "Good morning, Mama," he teased, deliberately emphasizing the new role she was stepping into. Diep blushed, swatting lightly at his shoulder. "Don't start calling me that so soon," she said, though the glow in her eyes betrayed how much the words meant to her. They sat down to eat, and conversation flowed naturally. James talked about his work trips, about how he wanted to finish them quickly so he could be home before the baby's arrival. He promised her that he would rearrange everything if necessary. Diep listened quietly, her heart warming with each word. She could feel the weight of his commitment, not just to her, but to the life they had created together. After breakfast, James suggested a walk. The village roads stretched out beneath the bright morning sun, lined with cassava fields swaying in the breeze. Diep walked slowly, one hand on her belly, while James stayed close, occasionally pointing out little details. The way the leaves caught the light, the chirping of birds in the distance. At one point, they passed a group of children playing with a ball. Diep stopped, watching them with quiet fascination. She imagined their son joining in, his laughter blending with theirs, his little feet kicking up dust as he ran. She turned to James, her voice soft. "Do you think he'll have your smile?" James chuckled, shaking his head. "I hope he has yours. It lights up everything around you." His gaze lingered on her, steady and full of admiration. Diep felt her cheeks flush, and she looked away. But inside, her heart swelled with warmth. The two of them wandered further, eventually reaching a small pond where lotus flowers floated on the surface. They sat on a nearby rock, the air filled with the fragrance of blossoms. James picked a small lotus bud and handed it to Diep. "This is for you," he said, "pure and strong, like you." Diep cradled the flower in her hands, touched beyond words. In that moment, she realized just how deeply James saw her, not as someone fragile, but as someone capable of nurturing life, someone resilient. The thought made her chest tighten with emotion. Later that afternoon, James drove her into town to shop for baby things. Diep had been hesitant, worrying about money, but James reassured her that he had saved enough. The store brimmed with tiny clothes, soft blankets, and toys that jingled when touched. Diep's eyes grew wide as she touched a small blue onesie, imagining her son wearing it. James noticed her hesitation and placed it gently into the basket. "He'll need this," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Diep laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're going to spoil him." "Of course," James replied with a grin. "That's my job as his father." As they walked through the aisles, Diep couldn't help but picture the days ahead. Nights of lullabies, mornings of laughter, tiny hands reaching for her. Each item they chose became a promise, a step toward the family they were building. On the way home, the car was filled with quiet joy. Bags of baby clothes and supplies rested in the back seat, while Diep leaned against the window, her thoughts drifting to the ultrasound once more. She could still see her son's face in her mind, so small, yet already carrying the imprint of James. That evening, they sat on the porch as twilight descended. The crickets began their chorus, and fireflies flickered across the fields. James held Diep's hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her skin. "I keep thinking about him," he admitted softly. "How he'll sound when he laughs, what his first word will be, if he'll love climbing trees like I did." Diep smiled, her gaze on the horizon. "Maybe he'll love the quiet things, like reading or planting flowers. Maybe he'll surprise us both." Their conversation stretched into the night, weaving dreams and hopes like threads in a tapestry. They spoke of schools, of holidays, of the values they wanted to pass on. Diep shared her desire for their son to grow up kind, someone who respected others and carried warmth wherever he went. James nodded, promising to teach him strength, responsibility, and the courage to face life's storms. As the stars shone brighter above them, silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of contentment, of two souls bound together by a future they could finally envision. When Diep finally went to bed, she lay awake for a while, one hand resting gently over her belly. She whispered softly to her unborn son, telling him of the world waiting for him, of the love surrounding him already. Her voice was tender, almost like a lullaby, carrying her promises into the night. James lingered by the window, looking out at the moonlit fields. He had faced countless challenges in business, endured sleepless nights and difficult decisions, but nothing had ever felt as important as this, being ready for the little boy they had seen on that screen. His heart, once driven by ambition, now pulsed with a simpler, purer desire to be a good father, to be present, to protect the family he had with Diep. As sleep finally claimed them both, the house was wrapped in a quiet peace. The world outside hummed with crickets and the gentle breeze, but within those walls, there was only the steady rhythm of love. The ultrasound had given them more than just an image. It had given them a vision of their future, a son with James's face, a child who would carry their love forward. And with that vision, James and Diep found not just joy, but strength. Together, they were ready to face whatever lay ahead.